It was such a beautiful game, I don't even have to describe it. These are the words of Hans Niemann following this game played at the U.S. Championship when Grandmaster Christian Kairila attempted to interview him about the content of this game. He said those words, got up from his chair, and walked away without answering a single question. It's a very interesting game. His opponent is Christopher Yoo, and Christopher, who has the white pieces, decides to play the Jobava London system against Hans Niemann. Well, that's one of Hans Niemann's favorite openings. In fact, he has a chessable course on the Jobava London system. So really an interesting choice from Christopher Yoo, who has the white pieces in this game. Hans Niemann has the black pieces, and we are going to try to describe it. So let's jump in. Christopher played d4, obviously, for the Jobava London, knight c3, d5, and bishop to f4, the distinctive move of the Jobava London system. And e6 was played by Hans Niemann. This is the standard move, and really the recommended, not refutation, but equalizing line. A knight to b5, immediately attacking the c7 pawn, threatening knight takes c7 check. So Hans Niemann plays knight to a6 to defend the c7 pawn, all standard. e3, bishop e7, knight f3, castles, and bishop to e2. And here Hans Niemann decides to go for the two bishops and plays knight to h5. Grab on f4. Christopher Yoo says, not so fast, and plays the bishop to e5, but then f6, kicks the bishop back. And Hans doesn't take the bishop, at least not right away. First, he plays c6, kicking the knight away. And then when the knight moves, he plays the natural pawn break for black, c5. And he didn't lose a tempo because he gained a tempo by kicking the knight away, so it breaks even. Castling was the move. White could try to save the two bishops by playing bishop to h4, maybe playing g4. That was an aggressive idea from White. But he castles, and knight takes, bishop, pawn takes. And here, Hans Niemann plays c4, which is a novelty. And basically, it's a clamping down on the queen side, giving him a lot of queen side space. The bishop can go, knight, can go to c7. The pawn can go to b5. The only thing he has to worry about is, can White break in the center and create problems that way? In fact, White plays that move immediately. That's his main pawn break. And Hans Niemann plays bishop to b4. He's saying, I'm willing to give up the two bishops that I have to wreck your queenside pawn structure and undermine the center. So Christopher plays pawn takes, then pawn takes, and now he moves the knight back to b1. The idea is he wants to keep his pawn structure intact, play c3, and get the knight back into the game via d2. Knight to c7, bringing the knight back into the game, adding some defense to this pawn and preparing b5. c3, bishop to d6. And essentially we have an equal position here. Black does have more space and the bishops, but there's also this d5 pawn, and White can arrange to put some pressure on this. It's sort of a natural target for the white pieces. Knight b to d2, b5, gaining space and playing on the side of the board where he has the advantage. Knight to e1 was played. Computers suggest that Christopher Yoo could have played a4, and that would have been a playable idea for him. Knight to e1, bishop to e6, knight to c2. He's arranging his pieces to attack this pawn. You can see the knight going here, the bishop going here, both aiming at the d5 pawn. Queen to d7. Computers actually prefer the move rook to b8 and also the move a5, just really doubling down on that queenside space gain. Hans Niemann just gets his queen off of the back rank. Rook to e1, now a5. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to click the subscribe button, the like button, and the bell notification for future videos. So Christopher plays a3, right, to stop or slow down Hans Niemann's queenside expansion. g6. Now, this is an odd move, definitely not recommended by the computers. And what he's doing, he's trying to play on both sides of the board. We already see that Hans Niemann's gained space on the queen side. Now he wants to expand on the king side. Very ambitious play from Hans Niemann. The knight goes to f1. Again, the idea that it might be able to rout and pressure d5. h5. Coming after the king side now. Really ambitious chess from Hans Niemann. It looks like he might be able to play g5 at some point and even get a kingside attack going. Queen to d2, threatening to just hop into h6, so king to g7 to keep the queen out. And he wants to play the rook to h8, maybe break open the h-file and cause trouble on the king side as well. f4 keeps black from playing g5 at the very least. Rook to h8, threatening to play h4 and open up that h-file and go after that king. Bishop to f3, targeting the d5 pawn as we've discussed. f5 is played, putting a clamp on the g4 square so that when he plays h4, white can't bypass it and play g4 himself, because now that square is totally clamped down. Rook to e2, a little bit better at this point was rook to e5, which he does play this idea a bit later. This is a very strong exchange sacrifice idea. If Hans takes it, he loses the dark square bishop, and there's a lot of pressure on d5. But rook to e2 is played in the game. The knight goes back and hop into f6, jump into the e4 square or even the g4 square. Rook a to e1, doubling, threatening to take the bishop, so Hans Niemann moves the bishop. Now rook to e5 was played. And Hans does not take that rook. Takes, knight to c7, queen to f2, and the rook can come, the bishop can come, the knight can get this nice square. White has nice compensation in that position. So instead, Hans Niemann plays knight to f6, again aiming at these two juicy squares. Knight f to e3, aiming at the d5 square. Now h4 was played, attempting to open up that h-file and get at Christopher Yoo's king. Queen to f2 to defend the g3 pawn. And now h3. A slightly better move was probably knight to h5, putting some pressure on these two squares. But he goes ahead and plays h3 immediately, bypasses that pawn to open the h-file more directly. The white could probably take here. Computers say after this particular exchange, taking on d5, that position is better for white. But he plays the rook to e2 instead. Rook a to d8, adding to the defense of d5, at least indirectly. The queen goes to e1. Again, computers like queen to f1 a little bit better. Definitely not taking the pawn in this position, because very quickly black would double on the file, and even after taking, black is better in this position. You could take here and cause all kinds of chaos around white's king. But in this position, queen to e1 was played by Christopher Yoo. Now the knight jumps into the beautiful e4 square, and g4 was played. Commentators suggested that taking the pawn with the rook was the best defense for white. After g4, bishop to e5 was played. Pawn takes, and now hg2. So he did grab the exchange, but he's saying, I have enough counterplay against white's king that I don't have to worry about what I've given up in the center here. Rook takes g2, and boom, rook to h3. Attempting to double on the h-file, and he gains a tempo against the f3 bishop in the process. Now, the best idea for Christopher Yoo here is to take on e4. And after, say, if fe4, then rook h2, and this looks like a fairly equal position, but better would be de4. And after knight to d4 takes, and then doubling on the h-file. And here, Hans Niemann is still better. But Christopher Yoo plays the move e6, sacrificing in an attempt to maybe open up some of these, lines in the center. And it doesn't really work out like he had hoped. After e6, bishop takes e6, pawn takes, and bishop takes f5. He does not want to play rook takes f3 here, by the way, because then after rook g6, king f8, queen h4, white has enough counterplay against black's king to hold the draw. So instead, he takes on f5 with the bishop. Knight captures f5, check, queen captures f5, and now knight to d4, hitting the queen at f5. It would be a blunder here to play the move bishop to g4. Looks good, right? He's double attacking the queen and the rook. But in this case, rook d to h8 immediately. And obviously, he can't take the queen because it would just be mate on h1. And a bishop takes rook, queen takes rook, and the threats against White's king are completely decisive. So instead, Christopher Yoo plays the knight to d4. That hits the queen, and here he plays queen to f6, a very strong move. It would be a mistake to play queen to f7, which looks kind of like it's the same. But the problem is, after f5, the king moves and pawn takes, and it gains a tempo against that f7 queen. Whereas after f6, if he plays f5, king h8, and then if rook takes g6, rook to g8, would pin that rook and get rid of White's activity. So queen to f6, a very subtle, very impressive move from Hans Niemann. Bishop takes knight, and here, instead of just retaking the bishop, he's still completely winning after this. Say queen e4, king h7, rook to g5. It looks like White's getting some activity. Black is still much better, but instead Hans Niemann plays the superior move, rook to e8, pinning the bishop to the queen, and Christopher Yoo is in big trouble. f5 was played, rook takes bishop, queen f2, rook e to h4, threatening mate on h1, rook g6 check, and here just queen takes the rook, pawn takes the queen, and after a couple of checks, takes the queen, and here he has an endgame up in exchange, and he doesn't take real long. Christopher Yoo did play on for a while, but Hans Niemann just munches the pawns. And in this position, he plays a funny little finisher. Rook takes b5, and after knight b5, c2, king to d4, and Christopher Yoo resigns. So, is the game so beautiful that it needs no explanation? I'll leave that up to you. But even after this impressive game from Hans Niemann, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. Believe it or not, the game I think you're going to want to watch is this game, also by Hans Niemann. Click it to see some very impressive chess.